When the Second Boer War broke out on the 11th of October 1899, a young journalist eagerly set off to cover the story. His name? Winston Churchill. This is the story of how he ended up captured by the Boers and the daring escape which then propelled him into a political career that would last for over 60 years and culminate in him leading Britain and the free world during World War II. But it also tells another story, an almost forgotten story of the foreigners who fought on behalf of the Boer Republics, of some larger-than-life characters, and how one of them claimed to have crossed swords with Churchill himself. Winston Churchill, a former cavalry officer, had already seen action in 4 conflicts on 3 continents, written 3 books, and had run unsuccessfully for Parliament, which is not bad, seeing as he was just 24 years old. With an eye for being in the headlines, he'd earned the nickname Pushful the Younger, and he'd used his family contacts to join the British Army campaign in Sudan the previous year, much to the consternation of the Commander-in-Chief, General Kitchener. Kitchener, like many others at the time and indeed afterwards, distrusted Winston Churchill's seemingly constant desire to be in the limelight and to write articles for the press criticising his senior officers who he was serving in action. And Kitchener was not to be disappointed, as Churchill, having participated in one of the last great cavalry charges in British history at the Battle of Omdurman, then cashed in on his experiences and criticised Kitchener's tactics in his best-selling book, The River War. In 1899, Churchill had finally left the army to pursue both a more lucrative career in journalism and to begin his political career, fighting and losing a by-election in the Lancashire seat of Oldham. With storm clouds gathering in South Africa, the Morning Post newspaper engaged the ambitious young man as their journalist to cover the forthcoming Boer War. And it was a pretty good number for Churchill too. With the promise of £250 per month for a 4-month contract, he would earn twice his yearly salary that he was getting back in the army. Just 3 days after the war had started, he had embarked on the passenger ship the Botha Castle en route for South Africa. Also on the passenger ship was the new commander of the massive British army heading towards South Africa, the veteran General Sir Redvers Buller. And also accompanying the Morning Post editor was his valet and 18 bottles of Scotch whisky. Well, it's Churchill after all. By the time the Botha Castle had docked in Cape Town on the 31st of October, Churchill and Buller had received the news that the opening phase of the war was not going Britain's way, with the Boers having invaded the British colonies and were laying siege to the garrisons at Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith. Both as a journalist and as a man who thrived on the adrenaline of battle, Churchill set off at the front line in the Natal colony. At 6 a.m. on the 15th of November, just 2 weeks after arriving in Cape Town, he boarded an armoured train which was heading off on a reconnaissance mission towards the Boer positions, blocking that British relief of Ladysmith. Apart from the journalist Churchill and the civilian driver and some railway plate layers, there were about 120 men from the Dublin Fusiliers aboard, under the command of Captain Haldane. Having passed through the station at Chieveley in Natal, they came under fire from the Boers on the nearby hillside. And as artillery joined the rifle fire, the train driver reversed at speed back down the line towards safety, which was just what the Boers were hoping for. As the train raced round a bend, the leading wagon hit a boulder that the Boers had placed on the track. The first 2 wagons were derailed, blocking the line. The British armoured train was trapped. At this moment, Churchill seems to have forgotten his role as a civilian journalist, and having liaised with Captain Haldane, raced down the track to the engine where the injured driver was all for giving up. Somehow Churchill convinced him to attempt to shunt the stricken wagons off the track. And after nearly an hour, the locomotive finally cleared the track. Having piled wounded soldiers onto the engine, Churchill and Haldane organised the rest of the Dublin Fusiliers to try and walk alongside the engine, using it as cover as they retreated back to safety. But with safety beckoning and the whine of Boer bullets whizzing far too close for comfort, the driver of the engine increased speed, leaving those soldiers behind. The Boers were now descending from the hills, and Churchill ran after the train to slow it down, but he couldn't close the distance. Returning back to the stranded infantry, he turned a corner to see two civilians on the track who he presumed were some of the civilian plate layers. It was only when they opened fire with their rifles on him he realised they weren't civilians, they were Boer fighters. Turning tail, he ran in the direction of the train, but suddenly found himself facing a mounted Boer just 40 yards away. The Boer aimed his rifle straight at the future British Prime Minister. Churchill decided to chance his luck and reached for the Mauser pistol that he had been carrying, an interesting fashion accessory, by the way, for a civilian journalist. And he found that he'd lost it whilst he'd been directing the train escape. Taking the maxim from Napoleon that when one is alone and unarmed, surrender may be pardoned, he raised his hands. As he trudged towards captivity, Churchill realised that he had 2 clips of ammunition on him. Moreover, it was soft-nose ammunition, otherwise known as dum-dum bullets, whose purpose was to expand on impact, causing horrendous injuries. Their use had now been banned by an international treaty at the Hague Convention earlier in 1899, a ban that had been opposed by both the Americans and the British. Interestingly, in the very first action of the Boer War, Boer commander Koos de la Rey had captured a British train en route to Mafeking and claimed that some of the ammunition on that train had included soft-nose bullets. And now, civilian journalist Churchill, dressed in khaki fatigues with an empty holster, was in possession of soft-nosed cartridges. Things could get very tricky indeed. Casually, he tossed the first magazine into the grass, but as he was in the process of getting rid of the second piece of incriminating evidence, the Boer demanded to know what he was doing. Churchill casually replied that he had found it in the grass, and the Boer took the magazine off him and threw it away. No more was said by his Boer captor, but remember this incident for later in our story. And so, young Winston Churchill had been captured by the Boers. But had he really been captured by the Boers? Keep up with me as I uncover a really intriguing story. A few years later, Boer General Louis Botha, who became the first Prime Minister of South Africa, was visiting London and was at a dinner. One of the dinner guests was regaling the audience with a story about his capture by the Boers during the war. It was Winston Churchill. Botha suddenly interrupted. "Don't you recognise me? I was that man that captured you." What a great coincidence. The only problem is that this omission by Botha was recorded by Churchill in his book, My Early Life, which was published in 1930. And by then, the talented Botha was long dead. So, was it true? What we do know is that Botha was indeed in the vicinity at the time of the armoured train incident. Indeed, he had commanded the overall ambush. So maybe he personally did capture Churchill. Tall story, but then history is full of sliding door moments, isn't it? But another, even more colourful soldier also claimed to have captured Churchill on that November morning. And he wasn't even a Boer. It's worth remembering that the Boer War was not simply a British versus Boer Republic entanglement. That's the sort of black and white version of history that many of us are taught. The British imperial effort brought in troops not just from Great Britain and Ireland, but Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Rhodesia, and even Ceylon. The Boer army of 88,000 men included over 6,000 Afrikaners from the British Cape Colony, who had more in common with their kin in the north than they had with Queen Victoria. And equally, there were residents of the Boer Republics who were no fans of President Kruger and were actually sympathetic to the British cause, as we're going to find out in a while, so stay tuned. The Boers, however, also did gain international sympathy. Despite issuing an ultimatum to the British and then invading British territory, many in the international community saw the Boers as victims of long-term British imperialism and aggression. The European press railed against Britain and gloated on her humiliations at the hands of the irregular Boer forces. But some Boer sympathisers went even further, travelling to South Africa to fight against the British. The Hollander Corps, consisting of over 600 men from the Netherlands and Belgium, including in their number the brother of the artist, Vincent van Gogh. A similar number of Germans also made their way to fight for the Boers, some of whom were involved in the Battle of Speenkop. The Scandinavian Corps were at the Battle of Machersfontein. 1,500 metres in front of the Boer lines, they bore the brunt of the attack by the Highland Brigade. Only 7 of the 52 men in that unit survived. And a monument at the battlefield, translated, reads, "They could not fold, they could only fall." The majority of the Scandinavian Corps surrendered along with General Cronje after the Battle of Paardeberg in 1900. Generally, the Boers might have appreciated the support of these foreigners, but they rarely embraced them, and even more rarely allowed them any positions of command. There were 2 foreigners who bucked that trend, both rising to the rank of general in the Boer armies. George de Villebois-Moril, veteran of the Franco-Prussian Wars and the French Imperial Wars in North Africa, commanded the Legion of France during the Boer War. This unit, numbering nearly 400 men, fought at the Battle of Colenso before suffering a defeat at the Battle of Boshoff, where the French general himself was killed. The other foreigner who rose to become a Boer general was Russian adventurer, soldier and journalist Yevgeny Maximov. This 50-year-old had served in the Russian army before resigning after an attempted suicide. Maximov then fought with fellow Orthodox Christians in the Serbian War of Independence against the Turks and the Greco-Turkish Wars, as well as alongside the Orthodox Abyssinians or Ethiopians against the Italian invasion in the 1895. He arrived in the Transvaal at the outbreak of the war professing to be a journalist, but he only ever wrote 1 article before he did what he did best, fighting. Maximov was one of about 250 Russians who fought on the Boer side during the war. Ultimately, he was to die in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05. Smaller numbers from other nationalities fought as well, like the Greeks, and 300 Americans, mainly Irish Americans, also fought for the Boers. Hardly surprising, based upon the history between Britain and Ireland, some Irish joined the Boer cause. Before war even broke out, 20,000 Irish men and women had marched through Dublin in opposition to the potential conflict. 2 Irish brigades were raised, principally from amongst the Irish community who had already settled in the Transvaal. The first was led by John MacBride, who would later be executed by the British for his part in the Easter Rising in 1916. The other was formed by Irish-Australian Arthur Lynch. As a British citizen, whether he liked it or not, Lynch was convicted after the war of treason, but he was pardoned. And ironically, he went on to support the British effort in World War I. People see history as very black and white, whereas actually it's far more complex than that, with so many nuances and twists and turns. And the Irish involvement in the Boer War is a case in point. Whilst several hundred Irishmen volunteered to fight for the Boers, other Irish nationalists, like Sir Roger Casement, who was also executed after the Easter Rising, supported the British cause in this war due to the treatment of black Africans by the Boers. And let's not forget that many Irishmen were fighting in the British Army, not least the Irish Brigade at the Battle of Colenso and the men of the Dublin Fusiliers taken prisoner along with Winston Churchill. Which brings us back to exactly who captured the future British wartime Prime Minister. Despite the foreign units numbering about 3,000 men, that was a tiny fraction of the 88,000 strong Boer army. It's even smaller when you consider that something like 34,000 foreigners fought in the international brigades during the Spanish Civil War. Anyway, with the Boer army in Natal was the Italian Volunteer Legion, made up of about 200 members of the Italian immigrant community from the Transvaal, commanded by yet another soldier, adventurer and author, Camillo Ricciardi. And Ricciardi claimed that he personally had captured Churchill. Ricciardi is another one of those colourful characters who seems to have been attracted to the excitement of the Boer War. Born in Alba in northern Italy just 9 years before Churchill, he, rather like Winston, spent just a few years in the Italian army, also as a cavalry officer, before seeking fame and fortune elsewhere. His career included being a military advisor in Thailand, or Siam as it was called then, a mercenary fighting for the rebels in the Spanish colony of the Philippines, and a war correspondent in China, and then in the Italian Abyssinian campaign, the same war in which Maximov had fought on the Ethiopian side, But in many respects, his actual career details were murky. He claimed to have been at the Battle of Adowa, where the Italians were defeated in Abyssinia, but no one seems to be able to confirm that. By 1899, he was in South Africa, and with the Italian Volunteer Legion, was based in Natal, reporting into General Louis Botha. Subsequently, he claimed that he had not only captured Churchill, but had turned a blind eye as Churchill had discarded those incriminating soft-nosed bullets. I said we'd come back to that. Churchill never mentioned any Italians in his capture and was adamant that it was Botha who had captured him. The problem we have with this story is we have one larger-than-life Briton who claimed he'd been captured by Boer General and future South African Prime Minister Louis Botha, and a larger-than-life Italian who seemed to have a checkered history with lots of holes in it. So who do you believe? I'll let you decide. But there is a third, more boring story, that Churchill was captured by a Boer. It just wasn't Louis Botha. Many in South Africa believe that the Boer in question wasn't a general, but Commandant Dolf de la Rey. In the 1950s, the elderly Boer War veteran Dolf de la Rey joined with fellow Afrikaner and Second World War flying ace Sailor Malan to form the Torch Commando, opposing the Nationalist Party of D.F. Malan and its apartheid policies. Once again showing that history isn't quite as clear-cut as people sometimes try and make it out when they're toppling statues or whatever. You know, not all Afrikaners supported apartheid any more than all British people supported the Boer War. Emily Hobhouse and David Lloyd George come to mind. But whoever pointed their rifle at him, Winston Churchill was now a prisoner of the Boers. And what a prize the Boers had. A 24-year-old ex-army officer and journalist was nothing of real note. But Churchill had pedigree. He was a direct descendant of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, and commander at one of Britain's greatest land victories over the French, the Battle of Blenheim. Indeed, Winston had been born in Blenheim Palace back in 1874. His father, Randolph Churchill, was the second son of the current Duke and had pursued a glittering political career, becoming Chancellor of the Exchequer and tipped as a future Prime Minister. So by default, Winston Churchill was a very valuable prisoner indeed. And that's before we consider his less than civilian antics on the armoured train. Strangely enough, despite his protests that he was merely a journalist, the Boers were having none of that, and they packed him off as a prisoner of war to a camp in the Transvaal capital, Pretoria. Churchill was not best pleased to be cooped up in the State Model School, which had now been converted into a POW camp. Not only was he a prisoner, but there were those 18 bottles of scotch with his valet back in Natal. But most importantly, he'd been removed from the centre of action and the paid writing opportunities that went with it. So together with Captain Haldane, who had also surrendered, and Lieutenant Brocky, he planned an escape. Interestingly, Brocky was actually a sergeant major masquerading as an officer so he could get better prison quarters. On the 12th of December, Churchill scaled the wall behind the latrines and waited for his comrades to join him. After waiting for about an hour, he heard Haldane telling him in Latin that the Boer sentries had got suspicious and they wouldn't be joining him. Now, once again, this is a recollection of Churchill. Haldane insisted that Churchill had basically gone ahead with the escape long before the appointed hour, leaving him and Brocky stranded. Again, who were you on to believe? What was a fact was that Churchill, who had celebrated his 25th birthday in captivity, was now on his own, in the Boer capital, 300 miles from safety, with no map, no compass, no food, all of which were with his other would-be escapees inside the prison. Whatever you think of Churchill, you have to admire his absolute self-belief that in this moment, he believed the task ahead was still achievable. News of Churchill's escape spread quickly. Back in Britain, the newspapers seized upon it, a small glimmer of good news after the 3 defeats in Black Week. The Boers, on the other hand, issued a reward of £25 for Winston Churchill, dead or alive. Making his way to a railway line, he jumped on a coal train and hoped it was heading east towards the neutral Portuguese territory of Mozambique. It was indeed heading in the right direction, but it stopped long before the border, in the coal mining region of Middelburg. Absolutely famished, Churchill jumped from the train and he saw a light in the distance. He went to the house and he knocked on the door. A man brandishing a revolver answered the door and asked him a question in Afrikaans. The game was up. Churchill blurted out his name in English. "Thank God you've come here," was the reply, also in English. "It's the only house for 20 miles where you'd have not been handed over." Of all the houses in the Transvaal that Churchill could have knocked on, this one was owned by a Brit, John Howard, manager of the local colliery. Howard hid him down a mineshaft until the 19th of December, when, with the help of a local Boer who was actually sympathetic to the British, he was spirited onto a goods train heading towards Mozambique. Finally, they crossed the border and arrived at Lourenço Marques, modern-day Maputo, capital of Mozambique. And there he made his way to the British consulate, and that very night he was on a steamer heading down the coast back to Durban. His arrival in Durban was the first of many occasions when Churchill would receive a hero's welcome in his life. He now convinced General Buller to re-enlist him in the army. The old general, rather like Kitchener in Sudan, was not convinced, especially as Churchill wanted to remain a war correspondent whilst being a serving officer as well. Eventually, the Morning Post newspaper agreed to pay his salary, and so Buller got an experienced officer at no cost, whilst Churchill got action and a handsome salary. Commissioned in the South African Light Horse, he was present at the Battle of Speenkop, and then he joined Lord Roberts in the British advance to the Transvaal capital of Pretoria. There, in true adventurer fashion that Yevgeny Maximov or Camillo Ricciardi would have undoubtedly approved, he rode up to the very POW camp where he had been held at the State Model School and accepted the surrender of his former guards. By July 1900, just 9 months after starting out on his adventure, Churchill was returning to Britain on board the very Dunnottar Castle that had brought him to South Africa in the first place. And he returned to Britain as a celebrity and a hero. And in the general election in October of that year, he was elected to Parliament for the constituency of Oldham in Lancashire, and thus begun a parliamentary career that would last until 1964. Not only does this story throw up the boy's own adventures of Winston Churchill, and let's face it, there aren't many British Prime Ministers who have actually been fired at, fought in battles, been prisoners of war, and had a price on their head, dead or alive. But this story also shows how history is never clear-cut. Humans make history, and thus history is as complicated, confusing, and inconsistent as human beings are. Finally, this story just throws up some intriguing what-ifs. What if Winston Churchill had managed to catch up the train as it sped away from the Boer ambush? Or he'd acted more like a civilian journalist and not an ex-soldier, and the Boers had just released him when they'd captured him? Would he have become a celebrity who could win a parliamentary seat at the age of 25 and propel a career that then took off? Or what if he'd been killed, either as he'd escaped from Pretoria, or in that ambush, whether it's by Louis Botha, Dorf de la Rey, Camillo Ricciardi, or some other unknown Boer fighter? How history could have been very different. But of course, that didn't happen. Before the Boer War, he'd written to his mother these words: "I have faith in my star that I'm intended to do something in the world." And he certainly did. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that story about Winston Churchill and the Boers, as well as finding out a little bit more about those foreigners who fought against Britain in the Boer War. Who captured Winston Churchill, really? Lots more videos coming your way, so don't forget to subscribe to my channel below, and in the meantime, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.